Good evening, dear friends, and welcome to Watson's Margins. I'm Edward, your companion for this quiet hour of reflection. Tell me, has the lamplight settled gently beside you tonight? Perhaps a cup of tea rests nearby, still warm. These are the hours when Dr. Watson set down his most careful observations, when reason spoke clearest through the silence. If these moments bring you peace, do subscribe to the channel. Now settle in comfortably. For as Holmes knew well, truth is patient, and it rewards those who observe. You'll find Watson's Margins on Spotify as well. The link awaits in the description below. Chapter 1. The Orderly Household of Addison Square. It was on a morning in early April of the year 1894 that I found myself seated at the breakfast table in our old quarters at Baker Street. I engaged in the pleasant occupation of perusing the morning papers, whilst my friend Sherlock Holmes directed his attention toward a small leather-bound volume concerning the classification of tobacco ash. The spring sunlight filtered through the windows with that peculiar clarity which follows several days of rain, and the bustling sounds of London life rose cheerfully from the street below. I confess that I had hoped for a quiet morning, for the rigours of our recent investigation into the matter of the Norwood builder had left me somewhat fatigued, and I relished the prospect of an uneventful day. My hopes, however, were not to be realised. At 9:30 o'clock, Mrs. Hudson appeared at our door bearing a card upon her silver tray, and I observed at once from the expression upon her kindly features that our visitor was a gentleman of some consequence. "A Mr. Lionel Markham has called, Mr. Holmes," said she. "He begs to consult you upon a matter which he describes as delicate." Holmes glanced at the card with that quick, penetrating look which I had come to know so well. "Markham," he murmured. "The name is not unfamiliar. Show him up, Mrs. Hudson, if you would be so good." Within moments our visitor stood before us, and I found myself regarding a man of perhaps 65 years, possessed of that bearing which speaks unmistakably of long service in positions of authority. He was tall and spare, with iron-grey hair brushed carefully back from a high forehead, and his features bore the stamp of habitual self-control. His dress was that of a gentleman of means, yet without ostentation, and I noted that his hands, though showing the marks of age, were steady and well kept. There was about him, however, a certain tension which belied his composed exterior, and his eyes, though meeting ours directly, held a shadow of some private anxiety. "Mr. Holmes," said he, after the customary introductions had been performed, "I am grateful that you will receive me. My friend Sir Reginald Musgrave spoke most highly of your discretion when I mentioned to him that I found myself in need of advice upon a rather singular matter." "Pray be seated, Mr. Markham," said Holmes, waving our visitor to the basket chair. "I recall your name in connection with the Foreign Office. You served in the Levant, if I am not mistaken." A flicker of surprise crossed Markham's features. "You are correct, sir. I retired from the administrative service some 3 years ago, having spent the better part of 2 decades in Constantinople and the surrounding territories. I now reside quietly in Addison Square with my small household." "And it is this household which occasions your visit," observed Holmes, settling back in his chair and bringing the tips of his fingers together in that characteristic manner which indicated his full attention was engaged. "Indeed." Markham paused, as though uncertain how to proceed. "The matter may seem trivial, Mr. Holmes, and yet it has disturbed me considerably. Some 10 days ago, I received a packet by post from Constantinople. It was a letter from a former colleague concerning certain administrative matters of a confidential nature, now long concluded. The packet was properly sealed with the sender's personal seal in red wax, and I placed it unopened in my escritoire, intending to read it at my leisure." "And you did not do so immediately?" inquired Holmes. "No, I had guests that evening, and the following days were occupied with other engagements. It was not until 3 days ago that I opened the escritoire and discovered something most disturbing." Markham withdrew from his coat pocket a folded letter, which he handed to Holmes. I observed that the seal, though still affixed to the paper, had been broken and subsequently repaired with fresh wax of a slightly different hue. Holmes examined the document with minute attention, holding it up to the light and scrutinising it through his lens. "The original seal," said he presently, "bore the impression of a signet ring depicting a crescent and star. The repair has been executed with some care, but the wax is of inferior quality, and the impression imperfect." "You are certain you did not break this seal yourself?" "Absolutely certain, Mr. Holmes. I had not touched the letter until I discovered it in this condition." "And the contents?" Holmes unfolded the letter and cast his eye over the text, which appeared to be written in a strong flowing hand. "That is what perplexes me most profoundly," said Markham, his voice betraying for the first time a note of genuine agitation. "Nothing appears to be missing. The letter contains only correspondence relating to old business, matters which were concluded years ago, and which are now of no importance whatsoever. And yet someone has clearly opened this letter. He read its contents, and attempted to conceal the fact." I observed Holmes's eyebrow lift slightly at these words, and I knew that his interest was thoroughly aroused. "You describe the contents as being of no importance," said he quietly, "and yet you come to consult me. Might I suggest, Mr. Markham, that there exists some contradiction between your words and your actions?" Our visitor coloured slightly, but met Holmes's gaze with dignity. "You are acute, Mr. Holmes. I will be frank with you. The matters discussed in this letter touch upon events which occurred during my service abroad. They involve persons of distinction and situations of some delicacy. While the facts are now past and the principals largely deceased or dispersed, I should not wish for these old affairs to become the subject of idle gossip, or, worse, a deliberate mischief." "Then you fear not the loss of information," said Holmes, "but rather its distribution." "Precisely. And who in your household would have had access to your escritoire?" Markham shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "That is the source of my greatest distress, Mr. Holmes. My household is small, and I have always believed trustworthy. It consists of my niece, Miss Clara Markham, who serves as my housekeeper and companion. She's a young woman of excellent character, and has been with me since the death of her father, my younger brother, some 7 years ago. Then there is my secretary, Mr. Edward Linton, a capable young man who has been in my employ for 2 years. Mrs. Greeley, my housekeeper of long standing, manages the domestic arrangements. Beyond these, only one other person has regular access to the house." "And that person is?" "Captain Robert Fawcett, a former military acquaintance who served in the same region where I was stationed. He is a frequent guest, and we often discuss old times together. He is a gentleman of honour, and I cannot believe he would involve himself in such a matter." Holmes rose and walked to the window, where he stood for some moments gazing down into Baker Street, his hands clasped behind his back. "You present me with an interesting problem, Mr. Markham," said he at length. "A letter of supposedly trivial content has been secretly opened within a household of respectable persons, all of whom appear cooperative and trustworthy. The act itself displays both daring and clumsiness, for while the seal was broken, an attempt was made to repair it rather than to simply destroy the evidence. This suggests a person acting under emotional pressure rather than calculated design." "Then you will undertake the investigation?" Holmes turned from the window. "I will, but I must have your complete candour, Mr. Markham. These old affairs to which you refer, were they such as might give rise to motives of revenge, blackmail, or other mischief?" For a long moment Markham sat silent, his hands gripping the arms of the chair. When at last he spoke, his voice was low but firm. "During my years of service, Mr. Holmes, I was called upon to conduct certain inquiries into matters of financial irregularity involving government funds. Some careers were ended as a consequence. I did my duty as I saw it, and I have never regretted it. But I will not pretend that all concerned accepted their fates with equanimity." "That is plain speaking," said Holmes, "and I thank you for it. Dr. Watson and I shall call upon you at Addison Square tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock. In the meantime, I would ask that you discuss this matter with no one, and that you secure your escritoire against further interference." Markham rose, relief evident in his features. "You have my deepest gratitude, Mr. Holmes. I shall expect you tomorrow." When our visitor had departed, I turned to Holmes with some curiosity. "A broken seal and an old letter," said I. "It seems a small matter upon which to build a case." Holmes had resumed his seat and was filling his pipe with that dark, strong tobacco which he favoured when in contemplative mood. "On the contrary, Watson," said he, "it is precisely such small matters which often conceal the greatest depths. Our Mr. Markham is a man of considerable self-possession, yet he is clearly frightened. He minimises the importance of the letter's contents, while simultaneously betraying deep anxiety that those contents have been read. He describes his household as trustworthy, yet comes to me with suspicions of betrayal, and most significantly, he speaks of old affairs and ruined careers, whilst insisting that all is now past and forgotten. You think he is concealing something?" "I think," said Holmes, lighting his pipe and sending a cloud of blue smoke toward the ceiling, "that Mr. Markham knows more than he has told us. And I think that before this matter is concluded, for we shall find that a broken wax seal may prove to be the least of our concerns. I knew better than to press him further, for when Holmes adopted this cryptic manner, it signified that his mind was already at work upon theories which he would not share until he had gathered further evidence. I returned to my newspapers, but I confess that my attention wandered repeatedly to the mystery of the broken seal, and to the troubled gentleman who had brought it to our door. Chapter 2. Visitors Without Secrets. The following morning dawned clear and mild, and shortly before the appointed hour Holmes and I departed Baker Street in a hansom bound for Addison Square. My companion had been unusually silent during breakfast, consuming his coffee whilst absorbed in a small notebook in which he had been making various entries. I knew from long experience that such silences presaged intense mental activity, and I respected them accordingly. Addison Square proved to be one of those quiet, well-maintained enclaves which exist in pockets throughout London, remnants of an earlier age when the city had not yet expanded to swallow every available acre. The houses were Georgian in style, built of mellow brick and arranged around a central garden to which only residents held keys. Mr. Markham's residence stood on the southern side, distinguished by a black-painted door and window boxes from which early spring flowers nodded in the gentle breeze. We were admitted by a woman of middle years, whose neat appearance and capable manner marked her at once as the housekeeper, Mrs. Greeley. She conducted us to a drawing-room furnished with restraint and good taste, where Mr. Markham awaited us in the company of a young woman whom he introduced as his niece, Miss Clara Markham. I observed Miss Markham with some interest, for she was not at all what I had expected. She was perhaps 28, with dark hair arranged simply, and features which, whilst not beautiful in the conventional sense, possessed a quality of intelligence and directness that was immediately appealing. Her dress was plain but well cut, and she greeted us with a composure which suggested both education and natural dignity. "Miss Markham assists me in all household matters," said our host, "and I have no secrets from her. I have explained to her the nature of your visit, Mr. Holmes, and she has assured me of her complete cooperation." "I am grateful," said Holmes, bowing slightly to the lady. Before I examine the scene of the incident, I should like to understand the geography of your household, Mr. Markham. Perhaps you would be so good as to show us the relevant rooms and introduce us to the other members of your establishment." We were conducted first to the study, a comfortable room on the ground floor overlooking the square. It was furnished as a gentleman's private sanctum, with leather-bound volumes lining the walls, a substantial desk positioned near the window, and several chairs arranged about a fireplace. Upon a side table stood the escritoire in question, an elegant piece of mahogany craftsmanship with a lockable lid. Holmes examined the room with that methodical attention which never failed to impress me. He studied the escritoire minutely, both inside and out, and I observed him pause to examine the surface of the table upon which it rested. He then turned his attention to the desk, passing his fingers lightly over its surface and examining the blotter with his lens. Near the fireplace he paused again, kneeling to inspect something upon the carpet, though what he saw there I could not discern. "You say the letter was discovered 3 days ago," said he, rising, "and you had placed it in the escritoire 10 days prior to that discovery. During those 7 days, who had access to this room?" "All members of the household, I fear," replied Markham. "The study is not locked during the day, and any person might have entered on some legitimate errand." "The escritoire itself was locked?" "Yes, but the key hangs in plain sight on that hook beside the bookcase. It has always been kept there for convenience, as the escritoire contains nothing of great value beyond personal correspondence." Holmes's expression suggested that he found this arrangement less than ideal, but he made no comment. Instead he said, "I observe that dust has been disturbed near the escritoire, suggesting someone stood here recently. There is also evidence that a candle was burned upon this desk within the past week, despite the fact that the room has good natural light and, I presume, gas lighting." "The candle is most perplexing," said Markham. "I rarely work in this room after dark, and I cannot account for its use." "And yet someone found it necessary to provide illumination," murmured Holmes. He moved to the window and gazed out upon the square. "Tell me, Mr. Markham, do you keep sealing wax in this room?" "I do." "A stick of red wax is kept in the desk drawer for correspondence." Holmes opened the drawer indicated and withdrew the stick of wax, which he examined closely. "This is of good quality," said he, "and bears no resemblance to the inferior wax used to repair the broken seal. Have you any other sealing wax in the house?" "Not to my knowledge." "Then whoever repaired the seal brought their own materials to the task. That is suggestive, Watson, is it not? It implies premeditation rather than impulse." Before I could respond, there came a knock at the door and a young man entered. He was perhaps 30 years of age, of medium height and slight build, with fair hair and the pale complexion of one who spends much time indoors. His manner was deferential yet not servile, and he carried himself with the quiet confidence of an educated man. "Ah, Linton," said Markham. "Allow me to introduce my secretary, Mr. Edward Linton. Linton, these gentlemen are Mr. Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson, whom I have consulted regarding a private matter." Linton bowed politely. "I am at your service, gentlemen. My employer has explained the situation to me, and I am happy to answer any questions you may have." "You handle Mr. Markham's correspondence, I understand," said Holmes. "I do, sir. Letters arrive each morning, and it is my duty to sort them, attend to routine matters, and bring those requiring Mr. Markham's personal attention to his notice." "The letter from Constantinople, did it pass through your hands?" "It did. I placed it directly upon Mr. Markham's desk. As it bore the marks of diplomatic correspondence and was clearly of a personal nature." "You did not open it?" "Certainly not. That would be a gross violation of my employer's trust." "And yet someone did open it," said Holmes quietly. "Can you account for your movements during the period in question?" Linton considered for a moment. "I work in the small office adjoining this study each weekday, from 9 in the morning until 5 in the afternoon. My movements are entirely regular and can be verified by any member of the household." "I see. And in the evenings?" "I reside in lodgings in Bloomsbury. I return there after dinner, which I usually take in my rooms unless Mr. Markham requires me to remain." Holmes asked several more questions regarding the household routine and the handling of correspondence, all of which Linton answered with an openness that seemed entirely genuine. When the secretary had withdrawn, Holmes turned to Markham with a thoughtful expression. "Your Mr. Linton appears most forthcoming," said he. "Now, I should like to speak with Mrs. Greeley and, if possible, with Captain Fawcett." Mrs. Greeley, when summoned, proved equally cooperative. She was a woman of perhaps 50 years, with the capable hands and direct manner of one long accustomed to household management. She confirmed that no strangers had been admitted to the house during the period in question, and that all tradesmen were conducted directly to the kitchen entrance, and never left unattended. "I keep a well-ordered house, Mr. Holmes," said she with evident pride. "Nothing occurs beneath this roof without my knowledge." "I am certain of it," said Holmes courteously. "Tell me, Mrs. Greeley, do you recall anyone working in the study during the evenings of late?" "I cannot say, sir. My duties keep me principally in the domestic quarters, and I retire early. Miss Markham would be better positioned to answer such questions. It was at this point that we were joined by Captain Fawcett, who had arrived in response to a message sent earlier by Markham. He was a man of military bearing despite being well past 50, with grizzled hair and a weathered complexion that spoke of years spent in hot climates. His handshake was firm, and his eyes held the steady gaze of one accustomed to command. "A broken seal and a red letter," said he when the matter had been explained. "It sounds like nothing more than servant's curiosity to me, Markham. I cannot see why you have called in Mr. Holmes for such a trifle." "Nevertheless, Captain, I value Mr. Holmes's opinion," said Markham with a touch of stiffness. Fawcett shrugged. "As you wish. I can tell you plainly that I know nothing of the matter. I'm a frequent visitor to this house, as we serve together in the same region and share many memories. But I've never touched Markham's correspondence, nor would I dream of doing so." Holmes questioned the captain regarding his recent visits and his knowledge of the Constantinople letter, receiving answers that were forthright if somewhat dismissive of the entire affair. When Fawcett had departed, promising to return for dinner as previously arranged, Holmes suggested that we take our leave. See, as we descended the steps of the house, Miss Markham appeared at the door, having evidently awaited an opportunity to speak with us privately. "Mr. Holmes," said she in a low voice, "I must tell you that my uncle is more distressed by this matter than he will admit. He is not a man given to imagination or nervousness, and if he believes there is cause for concern, then I fear there may be real danger." "You are devoted to your uncle, Miss Markham," observed Holmes gently. "I am. He's been more than kind to me since my father's death. This household is my home, and I would do anything to protect his peace of mind." Holmes regarded her with that penetrating look which seemed to see beyond mere appearances. "Then you must trust that I shall do everything in my power to resolve this mystery. Tell me, have you yourself noticed anything unusual in recent days?" She hesitated, then said, "Nothing that I could name with certainty. But there has been a tension in the house, a sense of unease. I cannot explain it more clearly than that." We parted with assurances of further communication, and Holmes and I walked in silence to the corner where we might hail a cab. It was only when we were seated and bound once more for Baker Street that my companion spoke. "Well, Watson, what do you make of our morning's work?" "Everyone seems open and honest," said I. "If one of them is lying, they conceal it admirably." "Indeed. And that, my dear fellow, is precisely what troubles me. We have here a household in which everyone tells the truth, and yet, somehow, the whole truth eludes us entirely. Someone opened that letter, someone repaired the seal, someone burned candle in that study after dark. These are facts, not fancies, and yet each person we have interviewed appears genuinely ignorant of the matter." "Perhaps the culprit is someone we have not yet met," I suggested. Holmes shook his head. "No, Watson, the answer lies within that household. I am convinced of it. But there are currents running beneath the surface of this affair which we do not yet perceive. Did you notice the faint scent in the study?" I confess I did not. "Sealing wax, Watson. Not the wax from Markham's desk, but a different variety, one with a distinctive odour suggesting a cheaper composition. And there was something else, something I must verify before I can be certain." He lapsed into silence, his fingers drumming upon his knee in that manner which indicated intense concentration. I knew better than to interrupt his reflections, and we completed our journey without further conversation. But as I stepped down from the cab before our familiar door, I could not shake the feeling that we had indeed, as Holmes suggested, glimpsed only the surface of waters whose depths concealed secrets far darker than a merely broken seal. Chapter 3. The Disturbing Discovery. 2 days passed without incident, during which Holmes occupied himself with a chemical analysis that filled our sitting room with acrid smoke, and caused Mrs. Hudson to make several pointed remarks about the state of her carpets. I had learned not to inquire too closely into such experiments, for Holmes was often reluctant to discuss his methods until he had achieved some definite result. On the afternoon of the second day, however, he emerged from his laboratory work with an expression of satisfaction, and announced that he would call upon Mr. Markham the following morning to pursue certain inquiries. That intention was never to be fulfilled. At 7:30 on the morning of the third day, we were awakened by an urgent hammering at our door. I descended in my dressing gown to find a distraught Miss Markham, accompanied by Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard. "Dr. Watson," she gasped, her face pale and her hands trembling. "You must come at once. My uncle, I fear he is dead." Holmes appeared at the top of the stairs, already dressed, for he had the peculiar ability to attire himself with remarkable speed when necessity demanded. "Miss Markham," said he, descending swiftly, "compose yourself and tell us what has occurred." She struggled visibly for control. I went to his study at 7 o'clock to bring him his morning tea, as is my custom. He often rises early and works on his correspondence before breakfast. I found him seated at his desk, but when I spoke to him he didn't answer. I approached, and then I saw that he was not breathing. I summoned Mrs. Greeley at once, and she sent for the police and for you. "You did quite right," said Holmes. "Lestrade, you have examined the scene?" The inspector nodded gravely. "I have, Mr. Holmes. It appears to be a natural death. The gentleman is seated in his chair as peacefully as if he had simply fallen asleep. There are no marks of violence, no signs of a struggle. The doctor I summoned believes it was a failure of the heart. Nevertheless—" "I should like to see for myself," said Holmes. "Watson, bring your medical bag. We may have need of your professional opinion." Within 20 minutes we had reached Addison Square, where we found the household in a state of subdued shock. Mrs. Greeley met us at the door, her usual composure shaken, and conducted us directly to the study. Mr. Linton stood in the hallway, his face drawn and anxious, while somewhere above I could hear the sound of servants moving about in hushed urgency. The study presented a scene that was at once peaceful and profoundly disturbing. Lionel Markham sat upright in his chair behind the desk, his hands resting upon the arms as though he had paused in his work to consider some problem. His eyes were closed, and his features bore an expression that might almost have been one of resignation rather than pain. Upon the desk before him lay the Constantinople letter, its broken seal once more visible. Holmes stood motionless in the doorway for a long moment, his keen eyes sweeping the room with that intense concentration I had witnessed so often. Then he advanced slowly, his movements deliberate and measured, pausing to examine the floor, the position of the furniture, and the various objects upon the desk. "You have touched nothing, Lestrade?" he inquired. "Only to verify that life was extinct, Mr. Holmes. Everything else is as Miss Markham found it." I approached the deceased and made my own examination. The body was already cooling, suggesting death had occurred some hours earlier. The face showed no signs of the congestion one might expect in certain forms of sudden death, but neither was there the peaceful repose of natural sleep. I noted a certain rigidity about the jaw and a faint discoloration of the lips that gave me pause. "He's been dead for several hours," I said, "perhaps since late last evening. The immediate cause appears to be cardiac in nature, though I should prefer to conduct a more thorough examination before making a definitive pronouncement." Holmes had moved to the fireplace, where he knelt to examine the grate with his lens. "Lestrade," said he without looking up, "you observed the letter upon the desk?" "I did. It appears to be the same correspondence that was the subject of your earlier investigation." "And you noted that its seal has been broken again?" Lestrade frowned. "I confess I did not examine it closely. You say it has been tampered with a second time. Observe." Holmes lifted the letter carefully and held it to the light. "The repair work we saw 2 days ago has been disturbed. Fresh wax has been applied, but with even less skill than before. Moreover, there is something else." He turned to the fireplace and extended his hand. Between his fingers he held a small scrap of paper, partially burned. This was in the grate. Someone has been burning documents. I moved closer to examine the fragment. Upon it, in a flowing script, were visible only the words, "Forgive what necessity forced me to do." "A suicide note, perhaps?" suggested Lestrade. "That would be a convenient explanation," said Holmes. were it not for several factors which argue against such a conclusion. He rose and approached the desk once more, his fingers moving lightly over its surface. "Observe, Watson." "What do you see?" I looked carefully, but could discern nothing unusual beyond the normal accoutrements of a gentleman's workspace. "I confess I see nothing remarkable." "Precisely, and that is what troubles me. Here is ink freshly spilled but wiped away. You can still detect the faint stain if you look closely. Here is a blotter, with impressions suggesting recent writing, yet there is no document upon the desk save the Constantinople letter. And here," he pointed to the carpet near the desk, "is a slight displacement of this chair, as though a second person had been seated opposite Mr. Markham." Lestrade shifted impatiently. "Mr. Holmes, with all respect, these are minor details. The gentleman was elderly, and had doubtless been under some strain. His heart simply gave out. It is unfortunate, but hardly mysterious." Holmes straightened and fixed the inspector with a steady gaze. "You are wrong, Lestrade. This was not a death attended by chance. Every detail of this scene speaks of human agency, of a meeting that took place in this room last night, of words exchanged and perhaps a confrontation. Note the position of the body. Mr. Markham did not collapse forward onto his desk as one might expect in a sudden seizure. He sits upright, facing forward, as though he had been in conversation with someone seated opposite him when death occurred." "You suggest foul play," said Lestrade, his tone sceptical. "I suggest that we are not yet in possession of all the facts. Watson, what is your medical opinion? Could this death have been induced by poison or other means?" I considered carefully. "The symptoms are consistent with cardiac failure, which could occur naturally or could be precipitated by extreme emotional distress. Certain poisons might produce similar effects, though I would need to conduct tests to be certain. What troubles me is the expression on the face. There is something there I cannot quite define, a suggestion of agitation rather than the peaceful release one often sees in natural death." Holmes nodded slowly. "Then we must proceed with the assumption that Mr. Markham's death, while perhaps not murder in the conventional sense, was nevertheless the result of events that occurred in this room last night. Someone was here with him. That person saw him die, and made certain arrangements before departing." "What arrangements?" I asked. "The letter, Watson. Why else would it have been opened yet again? And the burned paper in the grate, what was its purpose? No, gentlemen, we have here a sequence of events that demands investigation. Mr. Markham did not die alone, and whoever was with him in his final moments has knowledge that may prove crucial." Miss Markham appeared at the door, her face pale but composed. "Mr. Holmes, forgive the intrusion, but there is something I must tell you. My uncle dined alone in his study last evening, as he sometimes did when working late. He asked not to be disturbed. This morning when I entered, I noticed that the study door, which is usually left ajar, was closed fast. I assumed he had shut it for privacy, but now I wonder if someone else might have closed it when leaving." "What time did you retire last night?" Holmes inquired. "At 10:30. My uncle was still working when I went upstairs." "And you heard nothing unusual during the night?" "Nothing. I sleep on the second floor, and my uncle's study is at the rear of the house. I would not hear ordinary sounds from that room." Holmes questioned her further regarding the movements of the household, but she could add little to what we already knew. When she had withdrawn, Lestrade made ready to depart, clearly satisfied that the death was natural and required no further investigation. "You may be content with that conclusion," said Holmes, "but I am not. I shall remain here to conduct a more thorough examination. Watson, if you would assist me, I should be grateful." For the next 2 hours we subjected the study to the most minute scrutiny. Holmes measured distances, examined every surface with his lens, and made numerous entries in his notebook. He paid particular attention to the chair opposite Markham's desk, the fireplace and the window fastenings. He also requested samples of the sealing wax and the writing paper found in the desk drawers. At length he straightened with a sigh. "We have learned much, Watson, though perhaps not enough. What we can say with certainty is this. Lionel Markham received a visitor last evening, a person with whom he was sufficiently acquainted to grant a private interview in his study. During that interview, something occurred that caused Markham extreme distress. Whether that distress alone precipitated his death, or whether other factors were involved, remains to be determined. The visitor departed after Markham's death, in having first interfered with the Constantinople letter and destroyed at least one document by fire. But who was this visitor, I asked. Ah, Watson. That is the question which must now occupy our attention, and I fear the answer will lead us into waters far deeper and darker than a merely broken seal would suggest. This was not a death attended by chance, Watson, but by arrangement, and until we understand that arrangement, we cannot rest. As we left the house of mourning, I glanced back at the study window and felt a cold certainty that Holmes was right. Whatever had transpired in that quiet room, it had transformed a simple matter of violated correspondence into something far more sinister, and I knew that we stood now upon the threshold of revelations that would shake the foundations of that orderly household. Chapter 4. Motives in Shadow. The inquest into Lionel Markham's death was held 2 days later at the coroner's court and resulted in a verdict of death by natural causes, the medical evidence supporting the conclusion that the deceased had succumbed to a sudden failure of the heart. I attended in my professional capacity and found nothing in the proceedings to contradict this finding, though I could not entirely dismiss a lingering unease. Holmes did not attend, having declared that he had more productive uses for his time than listening to official pronouncements of the obvious. I found him upon my return to Baker Street surrounded by a considerable array of documents and newspapers, several of which appeared to date from some years previous. He barely acknowledged my entrance, so absorbed was he in his reading, and I took my customary chair in silence, knowing that he would speak when ready. At length, he laid aside the papers and reached for his pipe. The inquest went as expected, I presume. Natural causes. The medical testimony was unambiguous. And yet we know better, do we not, Watson? Oh, I do not suggest that Markham was poisoned or struck down by any conventional means, but he was killed nonetheless, as surely as if a blade had been thrust into his heart. Killed by knowledge, by fear, by the confrontation with truths he could not bear to face. You speak as though you know what occurred in that study, I said. I am beginning to form a theory, though much remains obscure. These past 2 days have been profitably spent in research. I have been delving into Mr. Markham's past, and what I have discovered casts a most illuminating light upon our mystery. He gestured to the papers spread before him. During his years in Constantinople, Markham held a position of considerable responsibility. He was tasked with overseeing the disbursement of certain government funds intended for infrastructure and development. It was delicate work, requiring both administrative skill and diplomatic finesse. In 1889, irregularities came to light. Substantial sums had been diverted, contracts awarded to fictitious companies, payments made for work never completed. Markham was appointed to conduct the official inquiry. And he uncovered the perpetrators? He did indeed. Several officials were implicated, including some of considerable rank. Careers were destroyed, reputations ruined. One gentleman, a Mr. Thomas Ashford, took his own life rather than face the scandal. Another, a Colonel Pemberton, was cashiered from the service and died in disgrace 2 years later. The investigation was thorough, Watson, and Markham showed no mercy to those he found culpable. I began to perceive the direction of Holmes's thoughts. You believe someone connected to that old scandal may have sought revenge? It is a possibility that cannot be ignored. Markham himself acknowledged that not all concerned accepted their fates with equanimity. And now we come to the interesting particulars. Holmes selected a sheet from among his papers. I have compiled information regarding the current members of Markham's household and their possible connections to these events. Captain Fawcett served in the same region, I observed, recalling our interview. Indeed he did. and while his name does not appear in the official reports, I have discovered through certain inquiries that he was stationed at one of the outposts where irregularities were detected. He was never formally accused, but there were questions raised about his knowledge of certain transactions. Nothing was proved, and he retired with honour, but the shadow remained. That would give him motive to resent Markham, or to fear him, Holmes amended. Fear, Watson, is often a more powerful motive than resentment. But let us continue. Mr. Edward Linton is also of interest. He is the nephew of the late Mr. Ashford, the gentleman who took his own life. I discovered this connection through the records of Somerset House. Linton's mother was Ashford's sister, and the family was devastated by the scandal and subsequent suicide. I felt a chill at this revelation. Then Linton entered Markham's service under false pretences. Not entirely false. He is indeed a capable secretary, and his credentials are genuine. But one must ask whether he sought the position for professional advancement or for some darker purpose. Proximity to Markham would have given him ample opportunity to learn secrets, to observe vulnerabilities. And Miss Markham, Holmes's expression grew thoughtful. Ah! Miss Markham presents a different consideration entirely. She is entirely dependent upon her uncle's generosity. Her father, Markham's younger brother, died leaving her with modest means at best. She has served as her uncle's companion and housekeeper for 7 years, effectively managing his household and, one suspects, his daily comforts. His death makes her the principal beneficiary of his will, as I have ascertained through discreet inquiries. She inherits both property and a substantial sum. But surely you cannot suspect her, I protested. She appeared genuinely devoted to her uncle. Devotion and self-interest are not mutually exclusive, Watson. Nevertheless, I agree that Miss Markham strikes me as sincere in her grief. But we must consider all possibilities, however unpalatable, and there is one more factor I have discovered which may prove significant. He produced another document, this one bearing the official seal of a banking house. Mr. Linton has debts, Watson. Considerable debts arising from gambling losses and imprudent investments. He is, in short, in desperate need of funds. Whether those debts would drive him to blackmail or worse, I cannot say, but they establish a motive beyond mere familial revenge. I sat back, attempting to assimilate this flood of information. Then any one of them might have reason to threaten Markham or to seek his destruction. But which of them was in that study on the night he died? That is precisely what we must determine, and there is one more piece of this puzzle which I have not yet shared with you. Holmes reached for the Constantinople letter, which he had evidently retained from the study. I have subjected this document to careful analysis. The contents, as Markham indicated, concern administrative matters now long concluded. But observe this. He held the letter up to the light, and I could see that it had been folded and refolded multiple times, like creating a complex pattern of creases. This letter has been studied with great attention, Watson. Someone has examined it repeatedly, searching perhaps for hidden meanings or coded messages, and I believe I know what they sought. What was it? A second document, Watson. A slip of paper concealed within the folds of the letter itself. It is an old trick used in diplomatic correspondence when additional privacy is required. The outer letter serves as an innocuous cover, whilst the true message is hidden within. The person who first broke the seal was searching for such a hidden communication. And did they find it? Holmes's eyes gleamed. I believe they did, and I believe that hidden message contained information so damaging that it led directly to Markham's death. Now, the Constantinople correspondent was warning Markham that someone from the old scandal had resurfaced in England. But the warning came too late, Watson. That person was already within Markham's own household. Then you know who it was? I have my suspicions, but suspicion is not proof. We must proceed carefully now, for we're dealing with a person who has already demonstrated a ruthless determination. Whether Markham's death was intended or merely resulted from the confrontation I cannot yet say. But I'm convinced that someone entered that study on the fatal night, someone Markham admitted willingly, and that during their interview truths were spoken that one party could not survive. What will you do? Holmes rose and began to pace the room, his hands clasped behind his back. I shall return to Addison Square tomorrow and conduct certain experiments. There are physical traces yet to be examined, and I must verify certain theories regarding the sealing wax and the burned papers. But more importantly, I must observe the household once more. Grief affects people differently, Watson. Some it renders vulnerable and transparent. Others it drives to conceal themselves more deeply. I wish to see how our suspects comport themselves now that the initial shock has passed. Do you not fear that the guilty party may flee? On the contrary, I believe they will remain. To flee would be to invite suspicion. No, Watson. Our culprit will stay close, will play the role of the grieving friend or dependent, will assist with the funeral arrangements and the settling of the estate. They will do everything expected of them, all the while knowing that they carry the burden of Markham's death. He paused by the window, gazing out into the gathering dusk. But they have made one critical error, Watson. They have underestimated the persistence of the dead man's final action. Markham placed that Constantinople letter upon his desk for a reason. Whether as evidence, accusation, or appeal, it was his last deliberate act, and it speaks to us still, if only we have the wit to interpret its message. I joined him at the window, watching as the lamplighters made their rounds below. You believe we shall uncover the truth? I believe we must, said Holmes quietly. Not for the sake of justice, which has already been satisfied by the verdict of natural death. Not even for the sake of the law, which can prove nothing without witnesses or confession. But for the sake of truth itself, Watson. Markham deserves that much, and perhaps, in the end, so does his killer. For I am increasingly convinced that this is not a simple case of malice, but something far more complex. We deal not with pure villainy, but with the terrible consequences of old sins and new fears. We stood in silence as darkness claimed the street outside, and I reflected that Holmes, for all his dedication to logic and reason, possessed a profound understanding of the human heart. He saw in this mystery not merely a puzzle to be solved, but a tragedy to be comprehended, and I knew that he would not rest until he had unravelled every thread of the tangled web that had led to Lionel Markham's lonely death. The game, as Holmes was fond of saying, was afoot. But this was a game played for stakes higher than mere intellectual satisfaction, and I sensed that its conclusion would bring not triumph, but a kind of sombre understanding of the darkness that may dwell even in the most orderly of households. Chapter 5. Holmes observes silence. The following afternoon found us once more at Addison Square, though our visit was unannounced and of a character quite different from our earlier call. Holmes had sent no message of our coming, preferring, as he explained, to observe the household in its natural state, rather than in the heightened awareness that advance notice would produce. We were admitted by a housemaid who seemed uncertain whether to announce us formally, but Miss Markham, hearing voices in the hall, emerged from the morning room and greeted us with wan courtesy. She wore black, as was proper, and her face bore the marks of recent tears, yet she maintained her composure with admirable strength. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, this is unexpected," said she. "I fear the house is somewhat at sixes and sevens. We are preparing for the funeral, which is to be held tomorrow." "We shall not disturb you long," Holmes assured her. "I have one or two small matters to verify regarding the study. Mere formalities, you understand, but ones which my conscience will not permit me to neglect." She conducted us to the familiar room, which appeared much as we had left it, save that the desk had been cleared and certain personal effects removed. Holmes moved about the space with that peculiar intensity which characterized his investigations, though yet he asked no questions and made no remarks that might have revealed the direction of his thoughts. "You are welcome to remain, Miss Markham," said he, "or to attend to your other duties as you see fit. We require no assistance." She hesitated, then said, "If you do not object, I should prefer to remain. This room holds many memories of my uncle, and I find a strange comfort in being here, despite the sadness of recent events." "By all means." Holmes had stationed himself near the fireplace and was examining the grate with minute attention, occasionally testing the bricks with his fingers. I took up a position near the window, uncertain of my role but content to observe. After some minutes, Mrs. Greeley appeared bearing a tea tray. "Miss Clara, I've brought tea for the gentleman. You've had nothing since breakfast. And you must keep your strength." "Thank you, Mrs. Greeley. That is thoughtful of you." Miss Markham's voice held genuine warmth, and I noted the affectionate familiarity between the two women. The housekeeper set down the tray with hands that trembled slightly. "It doesn't seem real, does it, miss? The master gone and so suddenly? I keep thinking I hear his step in the hall or his voice calling for his correspondence." "I know," said Miss Markham softly. "I expect it will seem unreal for some time yet." Mrs. Greeley departed, and Miss Markham poured tea with mechanical precision, her hands steady despite the evident strain upon her nerves. As she handed me my cup, however, I observed that her fingers trembled momentarily, and the cup rattled faintly against the saucer before she set it down. Holmes had moved to the desk and was examining the drawers with his lens, apparently oblivious to our presence. Yet I knew him well enough to understand that he observed everything, that every word spoken and gesture made was being catalogued in that remarkable mind. The door opened again, and Mr. Linton entered, stopping short when he saw us. "Miss Markham, forgive me. I did not know you had visitors. I came only to fetch the account books. There are several matters requiring attention before the solicitors arrive tomorrow. Mr. Holmes and Dr. Watson are conducting some final inquiries," she explained. "Please do not let us prevent you from your work." Linton advanced to the desk, and I could not help but notice that his cuffs were stained with ink, as though he had been writing extensively. His face was drawn and pale, and there was a restlessness in his manner that had not been evident in our earlier meetings. He gathered several ledgers from a drawer, holding them against his chest as though they were precious cargo. "Terrible business this," he said, addressing no one in particular. "Mr. Markham was a fair employer, perhaps the fairest I have known. I shall miss his guidance considerably." "You have prospects for future employment?" Holmes inquired, not looking up from his examination. Linton shifted uncomfortably. "Nothing certain as yet, but Miss Markham has kindly agreed to provide a character reference, and I am hopeful that something suitable will present itself." "No doubt it will," said Holmes absently. He had returned to the fireplace and was now engaged in some operation that involved the careful removal of ashes from the grate into a small envelope. At that moment Captain Fawcett was announced, and the study began to feel distinctly crowded. The captain greeted us with less than his usual bonhomie, and I observed that his military bearing had acquired a tension that suggested considerable strain beneath the disciplined exterior. "Mr. Holmes," he said curtly, "I had not expected to find you here. I understood the inquest had concluded the matter." "The inquest concerned itself with the medical facts," Holmes replied, straightening from his work. "My interest lies in other directions entirely." Fawcett's jaw tightened. "I trust you are not suggesting anything irregular. Markham was my friend, and I will not have his memory dishonoured by wild speculations. I assure you, Captain, my speculations are grounded in fact, not fancy. But perhaps you would be so good as to answer a question. When did you last see Mr. Markham alive?" "I dined here 3 evenings before his death. We spoke of old times, as was our custom. I left at approximately 10 o'clock and saw nothing unusual in his manner." "And you did not return subsequently?" "I did not." The captain's voice was firm, but I detected an underlying note of something I could not quite identify. Defensiveness, perhaps, or anger carefully controlled. Holmes made no further comment but turned his attention once more to the fireplace. The silence grew heavy with unspoken tensions, and I found myself watching the assembled company with increasing interest. Miss Markham sat with her teacup untouched, her gaze fixed upon some point beyond the window. Linton clutched his ledgers as though they might escape him. Fawcett stood rigid near the door, his hands clasped behind his back. And Holmes, seemingly indifferent to the atmosphere he had created, continued his methodical examination. It was Mrs. Greeley who broke the silence, entering to collect the tea things. As she bent to lift the tray, her eyes fell upon the study door, and I saw her glance toward it with an expression of such anxiety that I was moved to wonder what troubled her. "Mrs. Greeley," said Holmes suddenly, causing her to start, "how long have you been in Mr. Markham's service?" 22 years, sir," she replied, recovering her composure. I came to him when he first returned from abroad and established this household." "Then you knew him well?" "As well as any servant knows a master, I suppose. He was a private gentleman, not given to confidences, but always just in his dealings." "And in recent weeks, did you observe any change in his demeanour? Any suggestion of worry or preoccupation?" Mrs. Greeley hesitated, and I saw her eyes flick toward Miss Markham before she answered. "He seemed troubled, sir. Not openly distressed, but thoughtful in a way that suggested matters weighing upon his mind. But then, Mr. Markham was often thoughtful. It was his nature." Holmes thanked her and allowed her to depart. When she had gone, he turned to the assembled company with an expression that mingled satisfaction with something darker. "I have what I came for," he announced. "I thank you for your patience. Miss Markham, I wonder if I might impose upon you for one further moment of your time. There is a small matter regarding your uncle's papers that I should like to discuss privately." The others took this as a dismissal and withdrew, though I noted that both Linton and Fawcett cast backward glances of undisguised curiosity. When we were alone with Miss Markham, Holmes produced from his pocket the envelope into which he had collected the ashes. "I have recovered something from the fireplace," said he quietly. "A fragment of paper that was incompletely burned. It bears writing that may prove significant." He extracted the scrap with tweezers and laid it upon the desk. The charred edges were brittle, but the words were still legible. "Forgive what necessity forced me to do." Miss Markham gasped softly. "What does it mean?" "That is what I hope to determine. Can you identify the handwriting?" She leaned forward, studying the fragment intently. "It might be my uncle's hand, but I cannot be certain. The writing is somewhat irregular, as though penned under agitation." "Or by someone attempting to disguise their usual script," Holmes suggested. "Tell me, Miss Markham, and I beg you to answer with complete honesty, for much may depend upon it. Do you know of anything your uncle did that might require forgiveness? Any action that might have weighed upon his conscience?" She shook her head slowly. "My uncle was a man of principle, Mr. Holmes. His decisions were sometimes harsh, but they were never unjust. He believed in duty above all things." "Duty can be a harsh master," observed Holmes, and sometimes the path of duty leads to outcomes that trouble even the most resolute conscience." He returned the fragment to its envelope and placed it carefully in his pocket. "I thank you for your cooperation, Miss Markham. One more question, if I may. On the night your uncle died, did you hear anything from this room? Any voices? Any sounds of movement?" "Nothing," she said. "But as I mentioned previously, my chambers are on the second floor and I am a sound sleeper." We took our leave shortly thereafter, and it was only when we had gained the street that Holmes spoke again. "Well, Watson, what did you make of our afternoon's work?" "I observed considerable tension among all parties," I replied. Miss Markham's trembling hands, Linton's nervousness, Fawcett's barely suppressed anger, even Mrs. Greeley's anxiety. They are all affected by Markham's death in ways that seem to exceed mere grief. "Precisely. We deal not with hatred, Watson, but with conscience. Each of them carries a burden of guilt or fear or knowledge. The question is which burden led to Markham's death." He paused at the corner, his keen eyes distant. "But we progress, Watson. We progress toward truth, however dark that truth may prove to be." As we walked toward the thoroughfare where we might engage a cab, I found myself reflecting upon the peculiar nature of this investigation. We sought not a murderer in the conventional sense, but rather the architect of a tragedy born from old sins and new fears. And I wondered whether the truth, when finally revealed, would bring peace or merely deeper sorrow to all concerned. Chapter 6. Loyalty and Fear. Either the funeral of Lionel Markham took place on a grey morning that seemed to mirror the sombre mood of the small gathering. I attended with Holmes, who stood somewhat apart from the mourners, his attention focused less upon the ceremony than upon the demeanour of those present. Miss Markham bore herself with quiet dignity throughout the service, supported by Mrs. Greeley's steady presence. Linton stood pale and withdrawn, whilst Captain Fawcett maintained his military composure, though I detected a tightness about his features that spoke of inner turmoil. After the interment, as the company dispersed, Holmes approached Miss Markham and requested a private interview at her earliest convenience. She agreed to receive us that same afternoon, and so it was that we returned to the house in Addison Square for what proved to be the most revealing of our visits. We were shown to the drawing-room, where Miss Markham awaited us, still dressed in mourning. She'd composed herself since the cemetery, but I could see the toll that recent events had taken upon her spirits. She gestured for us to be seated and regarded Holmes with an expression that mingled apprehension with something approaching relief. "Mr. Holmes," she began before he could speak, "I have decided that I must tell you the complete truth, regardless of the consequences. I cannot bear the weight of concealment any longer." Holmes leaned forward attentively. "I am here to listen, Miss Markham." She drew a breath, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I read the Constantinople letter, Mr. Holmes. I am the one who first broke the seal." A silence followed this admission, during which Holmes's expression revealed nothing of his thoughts. "Pray continue," he said at length. "It was not deliberate betrayal," she said, her voice gaining strength. "On the evening the letter arrived, I'd gone to my uncle's study to retrieve a book. The letter lay upon his desk, and I noticed the seal had been partially loosened, perhaps damaged in transit. I confess that curiosity overcame me. I'd observed that my uncle seemed troubled of late, and I feared that some fresh difficulty from his past had arisen. I thought perhaps if I understood the nature of the problem, I might find some way to help him." "So you read the letter," said Holmes quietly. "I did, and what I read filled me with dread. It spoke of the old inquiry in Constantinople, and warned that one of those implicated had recently been seen in London. The correspondent urged my uncle to be on his guard, suggesting that this person might seek revenge or attempt to extort silence regarding matters best left buried." She paused, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I realized then that my uncle might be in danger, but I did not know how to broach the subject without revealing that I had violated his privacy." "What did you do with the letter after reading it?" "I attempted to reseal it, but I had no proper materials to hand. I pressed the wax together as best I could, hoping my uncle would not notice the damage. Then I replaced it in the escritoire and resolved to watch over him more carefully to ensure no harm befell him." "And you told no one of this?" "No one. I was ashamed of my action and fearful of my uncle's disappointment should he discover it." Holmes rose and walked to the window, his profile sharp against the pale light. "Your honesty does you credit, Miss Markham, even if your initial action does not. But there remains a difficulty. The seal was broken a second time and more skillfully repaired. Can you account for that?" "I cannot," she said. "I swear to you, Mr. Holmes, I touched the letter only that once." "Then we must look elsewhere for the second violation." Holmes turned back to face her. "I shall need to speak with Mr. Linton. Would you be so good as to send for him?" When Linton entered some minutes later, his face was already pale with anticipation of what was to come. He stood before Holmes with the air of a man resigned to judgment, whilst his hands twisting nervously at his sides. "Mr. Linton," Holmes began without preamble, "I believe you have something to tell me regarding the Constantinople letter." The young man's composure crumbled. "I do, sir. I am the one who repaired the seal after Miss Markham broke it." "You observed her reading the letter?" "No, but I discovered the damaged seal the following morning when I came to sort the correspondence. I recognized at once what had occurred. The wax had been clumsily pressed together, and it was obvious that someone had opened the letter. And you concluded it was Miss Markham." "I deduced it must have been either Miss Markham or Mrs. Greeley, as no one else had been in the study that evening. When I discreetly questioned Mrs. Greeley about her movements, Yeah, she accounted for her time in a manner that excluded the possibility. Therefore, it must have been Miss Markham. So you took it upon yourself to conceal her action, said Holmes. Linton's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. I did. Miss Markham has always treated me with kindness, Mr. Holmes. She has been more than generous in her consideration of my circumstances. When I understood that she had acted from concern for her uncle, rather than idle curiosity, I felt it was the least I could do to protect her from discovery. I purchased sealing wax of a similar colour and made the repair as skilfully as I was able. A chivalrous impulse, observed Holmes, though perhaps misguided. Did you yourself read the letter's contents? I confess I glanced at it, yes, but only to understand what had prompted Miss Markham's concern, and I saw nothing that seemed to warrant such anxiety. Because you did not know what to look for, said Holmes. He dismissed Linton with a gesture, and turned once more to Miss Markham. Your secretary is devoted to you, it would seem. She flushed slightly. Mr. Linton has always been most considerate. I had no idea he had discovered my transgression, much less that he had taken steps to conceal it. Loyalty is an admirable quality, said Holmes, though in this instance it has served only to complicate matters considerably. Now I must speak with Captain Fawcett. Is he available? Miss Markham rang for a servant and sent word to the captain, who was, we learned, in the study attending to some matter regarding Markham's military papers. He arrived within minutes, his bearing stiff and his expression guarded. You wish to see me, Mr. Holmes? I did, Captain. I believe it is time we dispensed with evasions and spoke plainly. You visited Mr. Markham on the evening of his death, did you not? Fawcett's face darkened. I did no such thing. Come now, Captain. I have evidence that places you in this house that night. It would be far better for all concerned if you spoke truthfully. For a long moment Fawcett stood rigid, his jaw set in defiance. Then slowly his shoulders sagged and he sank into a chair. Very well. Yes, I was here. But I swear to you, Holmes, I had nothing to do with Markham's death. Tell me what transpired. The captain's voice was heavy with fatigue. I came to speak with Markham about the Constantinople affair. I had learned through certain channels that the matter was being resurrected, that questions were being asked in official circles. I feared that my name might be drawn into any renewed investigation, and I wanted to know what Markham intended to do. You were concerned he might reveal your involvement in the old scandal? I was never involved, Fawcett said sharply, but I was present. I knew things, and in my position a mere association with such matters could prove ruinous. I came to appeal to Markham's sense of honour, to remind him of our long friendship, and to ask that he speak for my character should my name arise. And what did he say? He heard me out with his customary patience. Then he assured me that he had no intention of volunteering information that might damage innocent parties. He said that justice had been served years ago, and that he saw no purpose in reopening old wounds. We parted on good terms, or so I believed, and I left at approximately 10:30, and he was alive and well when I departed. You did not see the Constantinople letter? I did not. We spoke in the drawing-room, not in the study. Holmes studied the captain with that penetrating gaze that seemed to see into a man's very soul. And yet you returned later that same night, did you not? Fawcett's face went pale. How could you possibly know that? Because certain evidence in the study could only have been placed there after Miss Markham retired, which she did at 10:30. Evidence that bears traces consistent with your presence. I ask you again, Captain, what brought you back to this house? The captain's resistance finally broke. I forgot my gloves, he said miserably. I realised it when I reached home and returned immediately to retrieve them. I let myself in quietly, not wishing to disturb the household. I went to the drawing-room, found my gloves, and was about to leave when I saw a light beneath the study door. I looked in and saw Markham at his desk. We exchanged a few words, nothing of consequence. I remarked that he kept late hours, and he replied that he had correspondence to finish. That was all. I left within minutes. And he was alive when you departed the second time? Yes, I swear it." Holmes dismissed the captain with a weary gesture and turned to me. "Well, Watson, we have our confessions. Miss Markham read the letter from concern. Linton repaired the seal from loyalty. Fawcett visited twice from fear for his reputation. Each has told us a portion of the truth. Each has explained some element of the puzzle. And yet I am no closer to understanding what truly occurred on the night of Markham's death." "But surely these revelations narrow the field considerably," I protested. "On the contrary," said Holmes, "they complicate it immeasurably. We have honesty everywhere and truth nowhere. Each person has confessed to actions that were innocent in themselves yet suspicious in their concealment. Each has provided an account that is entirely plausible and entirely insufficient." He stood abruptly and began to pace. Someone entered that study after Fawcett's second departure. Someone sat across from Markham and engaged him in a conversation that led to his death. Someone broke the seal once more and removed something from that letter. Someone burned a document in the grate. And none of those I have questioned today, for all their confessions, has admitted to these critical acts. "Then there is another party involved," I suggested. "Someone we have not yet considered." "Perhaps," said Holmes. "Or perhaps one of those we have questioned is concealing the final, crucial truth beneath layers of lesser admissions. In my experience, Watson, the best place to hide a great lie is beneath a pile of small truths, and I fear that is precisely what has been done here." He gathered his hat and stick with an air of frustration. "Come, Watson, we have learned much today, but we are not yet at the end of this tangled affair. There is still one piece missing from the puzzle, one fact that will illuminate all the rest. And until I find it, Lionel Markham's death will remain an enigma wrapped in partial truths and incomplete confessions." As we departed Addison Square, and I could not help but feel that we were indeed close to some revelation, yet it remained tantalizingly beyond our grasp, like a word on the tip of one's tongue that refuses to be spoken. Chapter 7. The Acceptable Explanation. Inspector Lestrade called upon us at Baker Street 2 days following the funeral, bearing with him an air of satisfaction that suggested he had reached conclusions which pleased him considerably. He found us at breakfast, Holmes engaged with his customary newspapers whilst I attended to correspondence. The inspector declined Mrs. Hudson's offer of tea and came directly to the point. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, I thought you would wish to know that I have closed the file on the Markham matter. A straightforward case, as it turns out. Once one assembles the facts in their proper order." Holmes set aside his paper with an expression of polite interest. "Indeed. I confess I should be most curious to hear your conclusions, Lestrade." The inspector drew out his notebook with evident pride. "I have interviewed all parties concerned, and the sequence of events is now perfectly clear. Miss Markham, acting from natural concern for her uncle, opened the Constantinople letter and discovered its contents. The shock of this invasion of privacy, when Mr. Markham discovered it, brought on the fatal seizure." "You believe Markham discovered his niece's action," said Holmes. "I do. Consider the evidence. The letter was found upon his desk on the night of his death. He must have been examining it, perhaps noticed the imperfect repair to the seal, and deduced what had occurred. The realization that his trusted niece had violated his confidence would have caused him considerable distress." "And the second breaking of the seal?" I inquired. "Markham himself, in his agitation. He opened the letter again to verify its contents, to determine what his niece had learned. The inferior quality of the second repair suggests hasty work performed under emotional strain." "What of the burned paper in the grate?" Holmes asked. Lestrade consulted his notes. "I believe that to have been Markham's own writing, perhaps a note expressing his disappointment or forgiveness, begun but never completed. The fragment we recovered, forgive what necessity forced me to do, bears the character of a man grappling with his feelings toward a loved one who had betrayed his trust. You have verified the handwriting. I have compared it with samples of Markham's correspondence. While the script shows signs of agitation, the fundamental characteristics are consistent with his hand." Holmes rose and moved to the window, his back to us. And Captain Fawcett's visits? Entirely innocent, said Lestrade. The captain came first to discuss old business, returned for his gloves, and departed both times with Markham alive and well. His testimony is supported by the times he gives, which align with the other evidence. What other evidence? The housemaid saw a light in the study window at approximately 11 o'clock, which corresponds to when Markham would have been examining the letter and experiencing the distress that led to his collapse. Miss Markham herself heard nothing unusual because she had already retired and slept soundly. By the time morning came, Mr. Markham had been dead for several hours. Lestrade closed his notebook with a decisive snap. A sad case, Mr. Holmes, but not a criminal one. Miss Markham's action, while regrettable, was motivated by concern rather than malice. Mr. Markham's death was the unfortunate result of a weak heart subjected to unexpected emotional strain. There is no villainy here, only human weakness and tragic consequence. And Miss Markham accepts this explanation? Holmes inquired without turning from the window. She does. In fact, she has been quite forthcoming about her guilt in the matter. She blames herself entirely for her uncle's death and is consumed with remorse. Mr. Linton has been most supportive of her during this difficult time. How convenient for all concerned, murmured Holmes. Lestrade's expression hardened slightly. I detect a note of scepticism in your voice, Mr. Holmes. Have you some alternative theory you wish to propose? Holmes turned to face us at last. I propose nothing, Lestrade. I merely observe that your explanation, while tidy, rests upon assumptions that cannot be verified. You assume Markham discovered his niece's transgression. You assume his emotional state led him to re-examine the letter. You assume the burned paper was his own composition. These are reasonable assumptions, but they are assumptions nonetheless. Sometimes, Mr. Holmes, the simplest explanation is the correct one. You yourself have said that when you eliminate the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. I have indeed said so, Holmes acknowledged, but in this instance, I am not convinced we have eliminated all the impossibilities. Lestrade gathered his hat and prepared to leave. Well, the matter is closed so far as the yard is concerned. Miss Markham inherits peacefully. The household can resume its normal course, and we need trouble ourselves no further with late-night visitors and broken seals. He paused at the door. Unless, of course, you have concrete evidence of some alternative scenario. I have questions, Lestrade, but questions are not evidence. I shall not prevent you from closing your file. When the inspector had departed, I turned to Holmes with some perplexity. You seemed almost to encourage him in his conclusions. Do you believe his explanation? Holmes returned to his chair and reached for his pipe. Lestrade's explanation has the virtue of being acceptable to all parties. It assigns blame in a manner that permits forgiveness, provides closure without the messiness of criminal prosecution, and allows everyone to move forward with their lives. It is, in short, the solution that society desires. But not the truth? Truth, my dear Watson, is often less accommodating than fiction. Lestrade has constructed a narrative from the available facts, and I cannot prove him wrong. Yet there are elements of this case that his narrative does not adequately address. Such as, Holmes began to enumerate on his fingers. First, the sealing wax. I have examined both the original seal and the repairs. The wax used in the second repair is of a specific type, one not commonly available. It bears traces of a particular mineral composition that suggests a source outside London. Second, the position of Markham's body. He sat upright, facing forward, in an attitude more consistent with conversation than with solitary contemplation of a letter. Third, the burned paper. While the handwriting may resemble Markham's, there are subtle differences in the formation of certain letters that give me pause. Could these not be explained by his emotional state? Perhaps, and that is precisely the difficulty. Every anomaly I observe can be rationalized, every inconsistency explained away. I am left with nothing but a vague sense of unease, an intuition that something fundamental eludes us. He lapsed into silence, even smoking thoughtfully whilst I cleared away the breakfast things. When I returned to my chair, I found him staring at the ceiling with that peculiar intensity that indicated his mind was racing through possibilities at a speed I could not hope to match. "You know, Watson," he said at length, "there is an old legal principle, cui bono, who benefits. In this case, the answer appears obvious. Miss Markham inherits property and independence. Mr. Linton secures a generous character reference and possibly more, given the obvious affection between him and his employer. Captain Fawcett is spared any renewed scrutiny of his past. Even Mrs. Greeley benefits, as she will doubtless continue in her position under the new mistress of the household. Everyone emerges from this tragedy with their future secured." "You make it sound almost suspicious," I observed. "Do I? Perhaps that is because I am by nature suspicious of solutions that satisfy everyone so completely. In my experience, truth is rarely so obliging." A knock at the door interrupted our conversation, and Mrs. Hudson appeared bearing a card. "A Miss Markham to see you, Mr. Holmes. She says the matter is urgent." Holmes and I exchanged glances, and he gestured for our visitor to be shown up. Miss Markham entered a moment later, still dressed in mourning but with her composure more firmly established than when last we'd seen her. She declined the offer of a seat and stood before us with an expression of mingled relief and residual sorrow. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, I've come to thank you for your discretion in this matter. Inspector Lestrade has explained his conclusions to me, and while they paint me in a most unfavourable light, I accept them as just. I did violate my uncle's trust, and if that violation contributed to his death, then I must bear that burden for the remainder of my days." "You are resolved to accept Lestrade's explanation?" Holmes asked gently. "I am. What else can I do? The truth is that I opened the letter, and the truth is that my uncle is dead. Whether there is a direct connection between these facts I cannot say, but I can live with uncertainty more easily than I can live with the continued disruption of this investigation. My uncle's reputation deserves to rest in peace, as does he himself." "You are very forgiving of yourself, Miss Markham," she smiled sadly. "On the contrary, Mr. Holmes, I shall never forgive myself. But I have concluded that public accusation and legal inquiry will serve no purpose beyond prolonging everyone's suffering. If Lestrade's explanation provides closure, then I am willing to accept it as the official account, even if the complete truth remains known only to God." Holmes regarded her with an expression I could not quite interpret. "You are a remarkable young woman, Miss Markham. I wish you well in your inheritance and in whatever future you may build. Thank you, and thank you, Dr. Watson, for your kindness throughout this difficult time." She turned to leave, then paused. "Mr. Holmes, may I ask, do you believe I am responsible for my uncle's death?" "I believe," said Holmes carefully, "that responsibility is often more complex than simple causation would suggest. Your action set in motion a chain of events, but where that chain began and where it ended may never be fully known. You must make your peace with that ambiguity as best you can." She nodded gravely and departed, leaving us once more alone with our thoughts. I observed that Holmes sat motionless for several minutes after her departure, his eyes closed and his fingers steepled beneath his chin. When at last he stirred, it was to reach for his violin, and for the next hour our chambers were filled with a melancholy air that seemed to capture both the sadness of recent events and Holmes's own dissatisfaction with their resolution. That evening, as I prepared to retire, I found Holmes still seated in his chair, the violin now silent across his knees. "You are troubled by this case," I observed. "I am troubled by the ease with which truth may be buried beneath acceptable falsehood," he replied. "Lestrade has his explanation, Miss Markham has her closure, and society has its peace. Only I am left with questions that have no answers and suspicions that have no foundation. Perhaps that is the price of scepticism, Watson. One sees shadows where others see only light." I left him to his reflections and sought my bed, but sleep came slowly that night. I could not shake the feeling that we had witnessed not the resolution of a mystery, but merely its concealment beneath a veil of convenient assumptions. And I wondered whether Holmes, for all his vaunted powers of deduction, had been defeated not by the absence of clues, but by the presence of too many explanations, none of which could be definitively proven false. Chapter 8. The detail no one saw. 3 days passed in which Holmes maintained an uncharacteristic silence upon the subject of the Markham case. He occupied himself with a monograph on the varietal differences in tobacco ash from various regions of the empire, a project that had engaged his interest intermittently for some months. Yet I observed that his concentration was imperfect, and more than once I discovered him staring at nothing in particular, his pipe forgotten in his hand. On the 4th day, I returned from my morning calls to find the sitting room in a state of considerable disarray. Chemical apparatus covered every available surface, and the acrid smell of various reagents hung heavy in the air. Holmes himself stood at the centre of this chaos, his dressing gown stained with various substances and his eyes bright with the fever of discovery. "Ah, Watson, excellent timing," said he, without looking up from the microscope before which he stood. "Come, tell me what you make of this." I approached and peered through the eyepiece at his direction. Upon the slide lay several grains of what appeared to be a white crystalline substance. "Some form of mineral compound," I ventured. "Salt, perhaps, or sugar?" "Close, but not quite. It is pulverized carbonate, Watson, the sort used in medicinal tablets to ease digestive complaints and certain cardiac symptoms, and I found it embedded in the sealing wax from the Constantinople letter." I straightened, suddenly alert to the significance of this discovery. "You believe it has some bearing on the case?" "I believe it has every bearing." Holmes moved to his desk and retrieved the envelope containing the wax samples he'd collected from Addison Square. When I first examined the seal, I noticed certain irregularities in the wax composition. Yesterday I conducted a series of tests that confirmed the presence of this white powder. The question then became, how did it come to be there? Perhaps it was present in the wax itself. I considered that possibility, and tested samples of both the original wax from Markham's desk and the inferior wax used in the repairs. Neither contained any trace of carbonate. Therefore the powder must have been introduced from an external source during the act of sealing or resealing the letter. Holmes began to pace, his movements quick and purposeful. "Consider the mechanics of applying a wax seal, Watson. One must handle the letter, heat the wax, and press one's signet ring into the molten material. During this process, any substance on one's hands or carried in one's pockets might easily transfer to the wax." "Then whoever last sealed the letter carried carbonate powder on their person," I said, my mind racing ahead to the implications. "Precisely. And who among our suspects would have reason to carry such a substance?" He paused, fixing me with that penetrating gaze. "Markham himself took no such medication, as I verified through discreet inquiry with his physician. Miss Markham, being young and healthy, would have no need of it. Mr. Linton, despite his pallor, suffers from no ailment requiring carbonate tablets. Mrs. Greeley treats her occasional dyspepsia with herbal remedies. As I learned from a conversation regarding household accounts and expenditures on medications. That leaves Captain Fawcett," I said slowly. "Indeed, Captain Fawcett, who suffers from a chronic cardiac condition, a legacy of his years in hot climates. I observed during our first interview that he carried with him a small silver case, the sort used to hold medicinal tablets. When he reached into his pocket for his handkerchief, I caught a glimpse of white powder on his fingers, which he brushed away absently." Holmes returned to his microscope and made an adjustment to the focusing mechanism. "But there is more, Watson. Observe these pressure marks in the wax." He indicated certain indentations visible in the sample. "They were made by a signet ring, but not Markham's ring, which bore the family crest of a lion rampant. These marks, though imperfect, suggest a different device entirely." "And you believe them to be from Fawcett's ring?" "I do more than believe it. I have verified it." Holmes produced a piece of paper upon which he had sketched the impression from the wax. During one of our visits to Addison Square, I had the opportunity to observe Fawcett's signet ring closely. It bears the insignia of his regiment, a crown above crossed swords, These marks, when properly analysed, correspond precisely to that design. I sank into my chair, the weight of these revelations pressing upon me. Then Fawcett was the one who last handled the letter. But why? What could he have hoped to achieve? Holmes's expression grew grave. To answer that, we must return to the theory I proposed earlier. The Constantinople correspondent did not merely send a warning letter, as he enclosed within its folds a second document, a slip of paper containing information of a most specific nature. Information about the survivor of the embezzlement scandal? Exactly. And I believe that hidden message identified Captain Fawcett himself as that survivor. Not as the principal malefactor, perhaps, but as someone whose involvement had remained concealed during the original investigation. Someone who had managed to escape scrutiny through careful manipulation or fortunate circumstance, but whose complicity was nevertheless real. Good heavens, I breathed. Then when Fawcett returned that night for his gloves— He did not return merely for gloves, Watson. That was a convenient fiction, and one that we nearly accepted without question. No, Fawcett returned because he had learned, and through some means we may never fully understand, that the Constantinople letter contained evidence of his guilt. Perhaps he had confederates abroad who warned him. Perhaps he had been watching Markham's correspondence and noted the arrival of a letter from that particular source. The specific mechanism matters less than the fact itself. Holmes moved to the window and gazed out upon Baker Street with an expression of intense concentration. He came to the study that second time and found Markham examining the letter. There was a confrontation, Watson. Markham had discovered the hidden slip and understood its implications. He may have intended to confront Fawcett directly, or to turn the evidence over to the authorities. We shall never know for certain. And Fawcett killed him. Not with violence, no. But consider the sequence of events as they must have occurred. Fawcett entered the study and saw the damning evidence in Markham's hands. There was an exchange of words, heated perhaps, but controlled by the standards of their class and generation. Markham, ever the administrator, may have sought to reason with him, to offer some path toward acknowledgement and restitution. But Fawcett, facing the destruction of everything he had built in the years since the scandal, could not accept such an outcome. Holmes turned from the window, his face shadowed. The confrontation itself precipitated Markham's collapse. Whether through the sheer emotional strain or through some more active contribution by Fawcett, we cannot determine. But Markham died there, across from the man whose secrets he had uncovered, and Fawcett, finding himself alone with a corpse and evidence of his own guilt, made a fateful decision. He removed the hidden slip and burned it, I said. He did, and then, to conceal the fact that the letter had been tampered with yet again, he attempted to reseal it using his own materials and his own ring. It was hasty work, performed under extreme stress, but he hoped it would suffice. He then departed, leaving Markham seated as though he had simply fallen asleep over his correspondence. But the seal was broken once more, I pointed out. We found it damaged when we examined the scene. That was Fawcett's error, Holmes explained. In his agitation, he sealed the letter imperfectly. When he departed and had time to reflect, he realized his mistake. He could not risk returning a third time that night. But at some point before our investigation began in earnest, he found an opportunity to examine the seal again, and discovered it was even more obviously tampered with than before. In his panic, he may have broken it yet again while attempting to assess the damage. The multiple disturbances to the wax reflect not different persons, but a single person's repeated attempts to conceal his presence. I rose and joined Holmes at the window, my mind struggling to encompass the full scope of what he had uncovered. This is monstrous. Fawcett allowed us all to believe in Lestrade's explanation, allowed Miss Markham to shoulder blame that was never hers to bear. Indeed, and therein lies the true villainy of this affair. Fawcett did not murder Markham in any legal sense. The heart that failed was already weak, and the strain of discovery might have proven fatal regardless of any action on Fawcett's part. But he profited by that death, Watson. He removed evidence that would have exposed him, and he permitted an innocent woman to accept responsibility for a tragedy she did not cause. Then we must confront him, I said firmly. We must present this evidence and demand an accounting. Holmes laid a hand upon my shoulder. We shall, Watson. We shall indeed. But we must proceed carefully, for the evidence, while compelling to us, is circumstantial in the eyes of the law. Carbonate powder in wax, pressure marks from a signet ring, the theoretical existence of a document now destroyed. These are threads that weave a coherent narrative, but they are not proof sufficient for criminal prosecution. What then? And do you propose? I propose that we call upon Captain Fawcett and present him with our conclusions, not as accusers seeking legal judgment, but as investigators seeking truth. I wish to hear his account of that night to understand what truly transpired in that study, and I wish to offer him the opportunity to make what amends he can, even if those amends fall short of legal justice. He moved to his desk and began to draft a note. I shall send word requesting an interview tomorrow morning at his lodgings. It will be private, away from the Addison Square household, where we may speak frankly without fear of causing further distress to Miss Markham. You think he will admit the truth? Holmes sealed the note and rang for the page boy. I think, Watson, that Captain Fawcett has lived these past days with a burden that grows heavier with each passing hour. The human conscience is a powerful force, and even the most hardened soul may seek relief through confession when confronted with irrefutable logic. He paused, his expression softening slightly. Or perhaps I am too optimistic about human nature. We shall discover the truth tomorrow. As I prepared to retire that evening, I reflected upon the remarkable chain of reasoning that had led Holmes from a grain of powder in sealing wax to the unravelling of a carefully constructed deception. It was, I thought, a perfect demonstration of his unique genius, the ability to perceive significance in details that others overlooked entirely, and to weave those details into a coherent narrative that illuminated the darkest corners of human behaviour. Yet I could not help but feel a certain sadness at the prospect of the coming confrontation. We were about to strip away the comfortable fiction that had allowed all parties to move forward, and in its place we would offer only the harsh truth of concealment and moral cowardice. Whether that truth would serve any purpose beyond satisfying Holmes's relentless pursuit of accuracy remained to be seen. Chapter 9. Holmes explains the truth. Captain Fawcett's lodgings were situated in a respectable establishment near St. James's, the sort of residence favoured by retired military men of moderate means. We were shown into his sitting room by a manservant who informed us that the captain was expecting our visit. The room itself spoke of a life spent in service to the Crown, photographs of military units, a sword mounted above the mantelpiece, and maps of distant territories framed upon the walls. It was the room of a man who defined himself by his past. Fawcett rose to greet us with the stiff formality that had characterized all our previous encounters. Yet I observed immediately that something had altered in his demeanour. The rigid military bearing remained, but beneath it I detected a profound weariness, as though some internal structure that had long sustained him had finally begun to crumble. Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, please be seated. I confess I have been expecting this visit, though I had hoped it might not prove necessary. Holmes settled into the chair indicated and regarded our host with an expression that mingled scrutiny with something approaching sympathy. Then you know why we have come." "I believe I do." Fawcett moved to the sideboard and poured himself a measure of brandy with hands that trembled slightly. He didn't offer us any, and I sensed that the drink was medicinal rather than social. "You have discovered something that has led you to question the accepted narrative of Markham's death. More than question it, Captain. I have established beyond reasonable doubt that you were present in Markham's study on the night he died, and that you interfered with the Constantinople letter after his death in order to conceal evidence that would have exposed your involvement in the old embezzlement scandal." Fawcett did not attempt to deny the accusation. Instead, he drained his glass and set it down with exaggerated care. "How did you know?" I was so careful, so thorough in my precautions." "You were indeed careful," Holmes acknowledged, "but you could not account for every trace. The carbonate powder from your medicinal tablets became embedded in the sealing wax. The impression of your signet ring, though faint, was distinctive, and the very pattern of disturbances to the seal suggested repeated handling by a single anxious individual rather than multiple independent violations." Fawcett sank into his chair as though the weight of these revelations had rendered him incapable of standing. "I see. I underestimated you, Mr. Holmes. I believed that if I could obscure the physical evidence and allow others to construct their own explanations, the truth would remain buried. I was wrong." "Tell us what happened that night," said Holmes quietly. "Not the fiction you offered to Lestrade, but the truth entire." For a long moment Fawcett sat in silence, his eyes fixed upon some distant point beyond our sight. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and heavy with suppressed emotion. "You must understand that I never intended Markham harm. He was my friend, or as close to a friend as a man of my temperament could claim. We had served together, shared hardships, understood each other in the way that only those who have endured extreme circumstances can understand." "Yet you betrayed him," observed Holmes, without rancour. "I did. Years ago, during our time in Constantinople, I became involved in certain financial irregularities. Not as a principal, you understand, but as a facilitator. I knew what was occurring, and I allowed it to continue because I benefited from it. Small sums at first, and bonuses and considerations that seemed harmless enough. But the scheme grew larger, and by the time I recognized the magnitude of the corruption, I was implicated beyond redemption." He paused to collect himself, his military discipline warring with the evident need to unburden his conscience. "When Markham was appointed to conduct the inquiry, I believed my career and reputation were finished, but fortune smiled upon me. The principal malefactors were so obvious, their crimes so extensive, that Markham's investigation focused upon them entirely. My own smaller transgressions went unnoticed, concealed beneath the larger scandal. I resigned my commission at the first opportunity and returned to England, believing I had escaped." "But someone knew," said Holmes. "Someone knew. The correspondent who wrote to Markham. A clerk in the administrative offices who had seen documents I thought destroyed. He remained silent for years, but recently his conscience troubled him. He wrote to Markham, warning him that one of those involved in the scandal had returned to England and was living in respectability. And within that letter, concealed in the folds, was a second slip of paper bearing my name and specific details of my participation." "How did you learn of this correspondence?" I asked. Fawcett's expression darkened. "I still have certain contacts in Constantinople, men who owe me favours or fear my knowledge of their own indiscretions. One of them sent word that this clerk intended to write to Markham. I knew I had to act, but I did not know when the letter would arrive or what precisely it would contain." "So you cultivated your friendship with Markham, remained a frequent visitor to his home, watched for the letter's arrival?" Holmes said. "I did. And when I saw the diplomatic packet arrive from Constantinople, I knew my moment had come. I attempted to intercept it before Markham could read it, but the timing was never right. Then Miss Markham broke the seal. I observed her doing so from the doorway, though she did not see me. I thought perhaps I might use her transgression to my advantage, but when I examined the letter later, I found only the outer correspondence. The hidden slip was not immediately visible." "And so you resealed the letter and waited," Holmes prompted. "I did. I returned to the house on the night of Markham's death, ostensibly to retrieve my gloves. But my true purpose was to gain access to the study and search for the hidden document. I found Markham there, seated at his desk, and he had the letter before him. He had discovered the slip, Watson. He had unfolded the letter completely and found the accusation concealed within." Fawcett's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. He looked at me when I entered, and I knew from his expression that he understood everything. "Robert," he said, using my Christian name, which he rarely did, "why did you not come to me when this began? I would have helped you, guided you away from this path. But now you have lived a lie for so many years, and I do not know how to save you from the consequences." "What did you say to him?" I asked. I pleaded with him. I reminded him of our friendship, of the years we had served together. I told him that exposure now would destroy not only me but my family, those who depended upon my reputation and pension. I begged him to destroy the evidence, to allow the past to remain buried. And his response? He was not unkind, but he was unyielding. He said that he had spent his life upholding standards of honesty and accountability, and he could not abandon those standards even for friendship. He said he would give me 24 hours to make arrangements, to confess to the authorities myself rather than be exposed, but he would not conceal the truth. Fawcett rose and moved to the window, his back to us. We argued, though not loudly. There was no violence, no threats, but the strain upon him was evident. His face grew pale, his breathing laboured. He clutched at his chest, and I realised he was experiencing a seizure of the heart. I should have summoned help immediately, but I confess that for a crucial moment I did nothing. I simply stood there while Lionel Markham died before my eyes. The silence that followed this admission was profound. Holmes sat motionless, his expression grave, while I struggled with my own reaction to this terrible confession. "When he was gone," Fawcett continued, "I knew what I had to do. I searched for the hidden slip and found it still clutched in his hand. I took it and burned it in the grate, along with a note I'd written earlier in the evening, a note offering my resignation from society and asking forgiveness for what I was about to do. But when Markham died, my courage failed me. I burned the note instead and chose survival over honour." He turned to face us at last. I attempted to reseal the letter, though my hand shook so badly I could scarcely manage it. Then I arranged Markham in his chair, attempting to make it appear that he had simply fallen asleep over his correspondence. I left by the garden door, which I knew was rarely locked, and returned to my own lodgings. "You did not kill him," said Holmes, "but neither did you save him. You allowed him to die because his death served your purposes." "I did, and I have lived with that knowledge every moment since." When Lestrade proposed his explanation, attributing the death to Miss Markham's indiscretion, I said nothing. I allowed her to accept blame that was rightfully mine. I am guilty, Mr. Holmes, not of murder perhaps, but of something equally damnable, the murder of truth itself. Holmes rose and walked to where Fawcett stood. "You profited by Markham's death and sought to hide the truth. You manipulated circumstances to protect yourself whilst an innocent woman suffered needless guilt. The law may find you blameless, Captain, for proving your culpability would require evidence that no longer exists. But I wonder if you can find yourself blameless when you stand before your own conscience." "I cannot," said Fawcett simply. "I have not slept a full night since that evening. I see Markham's face every time I close my eyes, hear his final words asking why I did not trust him enough to seek his help before dishonour became my only companion." "What will you do now?" I asked. Fawcett straightened, and for a moment his military bearing reasserted itself. "I shall leave England, Mr. Holmes. I have already made arrangements to depart for the Cape Colony, where I have distant relations. I cannot undo what I have done, but I can at least remove myself from proximity to those I have wronged. Perhaps distance will bring some measure of peace, though I doubt it." "And Miss Markham," said Holmes, "she deserves to know that her uncle's death was not her fault." "She does," Fawcett agreed. "I shall write to her before I depart, confessing my role and absolving her of any responsibility. It is the least I can do, though it falls far short of adequate recompense." Holmes regarded him for a long moment, his expression inscrutable. "There is a higher justice than that administered by courts, Captain Fawcett. It is the justice of truth acknowledged and consequences accepted. You cannot restore Lionel Markham to life, but you can restore to his niece the peace of mind that comes from knowing she bears no blame for his death. See that you do so." We departed shortly thereafter, leaving Captain Fawcett to his preparations and his conscience. As our hansom carried us back toward Baker Street, Holmes sat in contemplative silence, his eyes fixed upon the passing streets. "You did not insist that he face legal consequences," I observed. "What legal consequences could be pursued, Watson? He committed no crime that any prosecutor could prove. Markham died of natural causes, hastened perhaps by emotional strain, but not by any direct action. The destruction of evidence is reprehensible, but not, in this case, prosecutable. We deal here with moral rather than legal transgressions. And yet justice demands some accounting." "Justice has received its accounting," said Holmes quietly. "Fawcett will live the remainder of his life knowing that he failed his friend in that final, crucial moment. He will carry the burden of his cowardice wherever he goes, for there is no distance great enough to escape one's own conscience. That, Watson, is a punishment more severe than any court could impose." We completed our journey in silence, and I reflected that Holmes, for all his dedication to logic and reason, understood profoundly the complexities of human guilt and the terrible weight of truth deferred. Chapter 10. Watson Reflects. The letter arrived at Addison Square 3 days after our interview with Captain Fawcett, and delivered by a professional messenger with instructions that it be placed directly into Miss Markham's hands. Holmes had received word of its arrival through his own channels, and he invited me to accompany him on what he described as a final visit to conclude the affair. We found Miss Markham in the drawing-room, the letter open upon her lap and tears streaming unchecked down her face. Yet they were tears of relief rather than sorrow, and when she looked up at our entrance, her expression held a gratitude so profound that I found myself moved despite my professional reserve. "Mr. Holmes," she said, her voice unsteady, "he has written everything. Captain Fawcett has confessed his role and absolved me of all responsibility for my uncle's death. He says that you confronted him with evidence of his presence that night, and that he could no longer bear the weight of allowing me to suffer for his actions." Holmes inclined his head gravely. "Captain Fawcett has departed England, I believe. The letter is postmarked from Southampton. He writes that he has taken passage to South Africa and does not intend to return. He begs my forgiveness, though he says he knows he does not deserve it." "And do you forgive him?" I asked gently. She was silent for a moment, her fingers tracing the edge of the letter. "I do not know. My uncle is still dead, and forgiveness cannot restore him to life. But I am grateful for the truth, Mr. Holmes. I have spent these past weeks tormented by the belief that my curiosity killed the man who had shown me nothing but kindness. To know that his death was not my doing, that I did not bear that terrible responsibility, it is as though a crushing weight has been lifted from my shoulders." "The truth often brings such relief," observed Holmes, "even when that truth is painful in its own right." She rose and approached us, extending her hand first to Holmes and then to me. "I owe you both a debt I can never adequately repay. You could have allowed matters to rest with Inspector Lestrade's explanation. Indeed, it would have been easier for everyone had you done so. But you persisted in seeking the truth, and for that I am eternally grateful." "Truth requires no justification," said Holmes simply. "It exists independent of our convenience or comfort." We spoke for some minutes longer regarding practical matters. Miss Markham had decided to remain in the Addison Square house, at least for the present. Mr. Linton would continue in her service as secretary and estate manager. Mrs. Greeley had expressed relief at learning the true circumstances of her master's death, and had declared her intention to remain in the household as long as she was needed. The orderly world that Markham had constructed would continue, albeit under new management. As we prepared to take our leave, Miss Markham detained us with one final question. "Mr. Holmes, do you believe my uncle would have forgiven Captain Fawcett had he lived long enough to hear his confession and appeal?" Holmes considered the question with his characteristic gravity. "Your uncle was a man of principle, Miss Markham, but he was also a man of compassion. He gave Fawcett an opportunity to confess voluntarily, which suggests he believed in redemption even for those who had strayed from the path of honour. Whether he would have ultimately forgiven him, I cannot say. but I believe he would have tried to understand, and that is perhaps the nearest thing to forgiveness that men of stern principle can offer. We departed Addison Square for the last time, and as our cab carried us through the familiar streets of London, I found myself reflecting upon the strange journey that had brought us from a simple broken seal to the revelation of treachery, cowardice, and the complex interplay of loyalty and self-preservation. It is a melancholy conclusion, I observed. Captain Fawcett is exiled, Markham is dead, and while Miss Markham has been freed from false guilt, she must now live with the knowledge that a man she considered a family friend allowed her to suffer needlessly. All cases are melancholy when one examines them closely enough, said Holmes. We deal always with human weakness, Watson, with the gap between what people aspire to be and what circumstances force them to become. Captain Fawcett was not evil in any absolute sense. He was simply a man who made compromises that led to greater compromises until he found himself trapped in a web of his own construction. You speak of him with surprising sympathy. I speak of him with understanding, which is not quite the same as sympathy. He made choices that I would not have made, choices that violated the principles by which I attempt to live. But I recognise that those choices emerge from fear and desperation rather than malice. There is a difference, Watson, between the man who does evil for pleasure and the man who does evil to avoid consequences. Both are culpable, but they are not equally damnable. I considered this for a moment, and yet you pursued him relentlessly, despite knowing that legal justice could not be achieved. Because truth has value independent of legal consequence, Holmes replied. Miss Markham deserved to know that her uncle's death was not her fault. That knowledge, that restoration of peace of mind, was worth the pursuit regardless of whether Fawcett ever faced a courtroom. Justice is not always a matter of punishment, Watson. Sometimes it is simply a matter of ensuring that truth is acknowledged and that those who bear undeserved guilt are freed from it. The cab delivered us to Baker Street, and we climbed the familiar stairs to our chambers where Mrs. Hudson had laid out tea and awaited us with her customary efficiency. As I settled into my chair and watched Holmes pour the tea with his precise, economical movements, I was struck by the realization that this case had exemplified everything I most admired about my friend's approach to his singular profession. He had not been content with easy answers or convenient explanations. He had observed where others looked without seeing, had questioned where others accepted without inquiry. And when he had finally assembled the truth from fragments of physical evidence and psychological insight, he had pursued that truth not for glory or recognition, but because truth itself demanded to be revealed. "You know, Holmes," I said, accepting the cup he offered, "when you first agreed to investigate this matter, it seemed a trivial affair, a broken seal, a letter of supposedly no importance. Yet it led us to questions of honour, guilt, and the price of past sins." "The greatest mysteries often begin with the smallest details," Holmes replied, settling into his own chair. "A grain of carbonate powder, a pressure mark in wax the position of a chair. These are the threads from which the tapestry of truth is woven. Most people see such details and dismiss them as insignificant. The art of detection lies in recognizing that nothing is truly insignificant, that every action leaves traces, and those traces tell stories to those who know how to read them. Will you write to Inspector Lestrade and inform him of the true resolution?" Holmes shook his head. To what purpose? His explanation, while incomplete, was not entirely wrong. Miss Markham did open the letter, and that action did set in motion the chain of events that led to Markham's death. The fact that Captain Fawcett's intervention complicated matters does not invalidate Lestrade's basic reasoning. Let him keep his closed case and his satisfaction. The truth has been served where it matters most, in the conscience of the guilty and the peace of mind of the innocent. I began to take notes, as was my custom, sketching out the broad strokes of the case for possible future publication. Holmes watched me with an expression of mild amusement. "You intend to chronicle this affair, Watson?" "I do, if you have no objection. It seems to me a fine example of your methods and of the philosophical questions that sometimes attend our investigations. I have no objection, though I would ask that you preserve the anonymity of the parties involved. The scandal that destroyed careers decades ago need not be resurrected for the entertainment of your readers. Of course, I shall disguise names and alter details as necessary, but the essential truth of the investigation will remain. The essential truth, Holmes mused. Yes, that is what matters. Not the facts alone, but the truth they serve to illuminate. In this case, the truth that conscience is the most implacable of judges, and that those who attempt to evade it through deception find only that they have constructed a prison of their own making. The afternoon wore on, and we sat in comfortable silence as the light faded from the windows and Mrs. Hudson came to light the lamps. I completed my preliminary notes and set them aside, knowing that in time I would shape them into a narrative that might serve to illustrate both my friend's remarkable abilities and the complex moral terrain through which his investigation sometimes led him. It has often seemed to me that my friend moved along a narrow path between law and mercy, between the rigid demands of justice and the softer appeals of human understanding. He was not a judge, though he often uncovered truths that judges could not reach. He was not a moral philosopher, though his cases frequently raised questions that philosophers might debate. He was, in the end, precisely what he claimed to be, a consulting detective who applied logic and observation to the unravelling of mysteries. Yet in the unravelling of those mysteries he served purposes larger than mere puzzle-solving. He restored peace to troubled minds, brought light to darkened corners, and insisted always that truth, however inconvenient or uncomfortable, was preferable to the most pleasant of fictions. In the case of the broken wax seal, as in so many others, he demonstrated that the smallest details might reveal the largest truths, and that the pursuit of those truths was its own justification, independent of legal consequence or public acclaim. Captain Fawcett departed these shores carrying with him the knowledge of his failure and the burden of his cowardice. Miss Markham remained, freed from false guilt but bearing the knowledge that trust can be betrayed even by those who seem most trustworthy. And Lionel Markham rested in peace, his final service to truth having been accomplished not through his own agency, but through the deductions of a remarkable man who refused to accept easy answers when complex truth beckoned. As I closed my notebook and prepared to retire, I reflected that this was perhaps the highest function of Holmes's peculiar genius, not merely to solve mysteries, but to ensure that truth, once discovered, served the cause of justice in all its varied forms. Legal justice might be beyond reach, but moral justice, the restoration of peace to troubled consciences and the assignment of responsibility where it truly belonged, was always within the compass of truth faithfully pursued and fearlessly revealed. Holmes had taught me, through cases such as this, that reason is indeed both compass and guide, but that the destination to which it leads us is not always the courtroom or the scaffold. Sometimes it is the quieter satisfaction of knowing that truth has been served, that the innocent have been freed from unwarranted guilt, and that those who have transgressed must face not the law's punishment, but the far more searching judgment of their own consciences. In this, as in all things, Sherlock Holmes remained true to his singular vision, that the world might be made more just not through the imposition of external authority, but through the persistent, patient illumination of truth in all its complexity and moral weight.